So today we'll be starting with a brief overview of the Accountability for Water programme, introducing our global evidence review into accountability and advocacy interventions in the water sector and the conceptual framework that we've developed over the course of our research and analysis. We'll then be digging into some of the key insights that have emerged relating to donor approach and how this can stimulate or subdue accountability in water governance. And we'll be looking at three areas: community dynamics, the enabling environment, and governance dynamics. We'll then be thinking about what are the different research priorities and knowledge gaps that have emerged over the course of our research. And then we'll be hearing from two professional research fellows who have been participating in our programme, undertaking original action research into neglected areas of water accountability. First of all, we'll be hearing from Timothy Kapere from Liberia, and secondly from Michael Nagash, who's based in Ethiopia. And we'll then have an opportunity for question and answers and discussion at the end. So feel free to start that discussion in the chat, but if you want to speak directly to the panelists, there'll be opportunity to do that at the end of the session. Thanks very much. So yeah, to give an overview of the global evidence review that we've been working on, this has been over the past 3 years, like a comprehensive review into the available evidence around what works, where and when it comes to accountable water governance. And over the course of this review, we have investigated and narrowed down our sample to 151 high quality papers, which range from various different sources, including journal articles, organizational reports, and working papers. And we published part 1 of the review, which was an overview and summary results, in August 2020. That was followed a couple of months ago by the second part of the review, which was on 5 focus countries in East Africa. And then just 2 weeks ago, we published part 3 of the evidence review, which was on priority themes for water accountability. And we identified 5 priority themes, which also constitute the foundation for this webinar series. So we had 2 weeks ago a webinar on gender and how gender dynamics can influence accountability. Today we'll be focusing on the role of donors, and then upcoming in the next few weeks we also have webinars on making governments listen, how best to measure accountability, and what's the impact of closing civic space on water governance. As I mentioned, we've got evidence organized according to these 3 areas: community dynamics, enabling environment, and governance dynamics, which help to develop our theory of change. And we conclude with research priorities and identifying knowledge gaps. You can read the full report on our website, accountabilityforwater.org. Hopefully Tim can post that link in the chat for you. And until then, I'm going to just give you a bit of a I'll just introduce some of the basics findings, and just to give you a flavor of what we found out. Great. So yeah, to start off, I just want to introduce the conceptual overview that we've had. Tim, maybe don't worry about the link, because just need to be able to see the screen at the moment. I can get that link in the bit afterwards. So yeah, the accountability cycle that we have here is what we've developed to try to conceptualize the process through which accountability can be realized. We've also dubbed this the 5 R's, because for effective accountable water governance, you need clear rules, norms, and standards which are in place and appropriate, well-defined responsibilities, including duties and obligations between stakeholders, and well-designed reporting and monitoring mechanisms, which are widely used and available, clear process for review and explanation of poor performance, and finally, an effective reaction by duty bearers through corrective measures and sanctions to address any failures in the delivery of water and sanitation services, or other problems identified, for example, around pollution control. We looked at a range of different accountability mechanisms, ranging from public interest litigation and public complaint mechanisms to social accountability mechanisms, which aim to strengthen citizen voice, or evidence-based advocacy, which focuses on media campaigns, for example. Next slide, please. And yeah, to introduce that in a bit more detail, I want to just give you a bit of a flavor of how we've organized the report, which starts for each theme with an evidence dashboard, where we try to give a visual breakdown of the evidence. And as you can see, for the role of donors, we had just over 30 papers out of our total sample, which focused on the role of donors and addressed how donor approach influences accountability. Most of these came from journal articles and organizational reports. And you can see on the map on the right-hand side that actually the evidence was fairly geographically uneven. A lot of it was clustered in East Africa and to a lesser extent in Southeast Asia. There was also an emphasis on water and sanitation rather than agricultural water management or water resource management, which were not discussed so much in the literature. In terms of the types of accountability interventions that were examined, efforts to strengthen citizen voice constituted the majority of papers. And there was a real emphasis that we saw on, strengthening voice through dialogue, processes, and debate, and also through the participatory design of projects and programs to improve localized water and sanitation services. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything in terms of the findings, but I'll introduce some of the headline findings that we found out. And first of all, I'm going to look at community dynamics. And what we found out was that cultural power hierarchies and elite capture can obstruct equity when it comes to the delivery of water and sanitation services, or the allocation of water in terms of water withdrawals for different water users, unless there's mitigating measures in place. And donors must be aware that power hierarchies operate at a local level, just as they do nationally or internationally. So for example, there was a paper by Ali from 2010, and this looked at how external priority setting could detract from bottom-up approaches in water service delivery. And it looked at how corruption and elite capture within local government meant that efforts to devolve and ring-fence budgets for community groups often floundered, and the funding was not spent effectively. Similarly, there was finding that accountability interventions need to strike a better balance between participation and inclusivity with effective training and professionalism. So there was a comparative study by Boston et al. From 2011, which looked at the performance of community-based wash workers in Tanzania and South Africa. And this showed how in the Uchira Water Users Association in Tanzania, there was disregard for chronically poor households who were trying to obtain water because, power had basically been handed to these local elites, and power dynamics had not really been effectively factored in. And while there was a need to employ professional water managers because the community management board didn't have the expertise or experience to operate these systems, there was a lack of interest at a local level to ensure that people who were qualified for the work were in place in those roles. And this highlights the unresolved tensions in the relationships between paid professionalism, volunteering, professionalism, and unskilled community work. Finally, another finding was that donors need to be flexible and responsive to locally determined priorities and evaluations of success. And a paper from Ballestero focusing on Costa Rican water politics highlights how the subjective dimensions of measuring accountability sometimes conflict between donors and local communities. So she illustrates how metrics of project success can differ, and the more open-ended experimental approaches that were favored by grassroots organizations were less of interest to donors because they believe these posed much greater risks in terms of investing, even though they offered potentially more innovative and transformative results. And while donors required discrete measurable outcomes, the local preference for this more open-ended and subjective process created a tension in terms of the differing conceptual languages and approaches that each stakeholder had. In this context, local organizations felt constrained by a sense of inferiority and disempowerment since they lacked the ability to speak in numbers. Next slide, please. In terms of the enabling environment, what we found in the literature was that colonial legacies and administrative structures often remained in place and continue to shape the context of donor engagements. So, for example, a paper by Laurie and Crespo looked at municipal wash provision in El Alto in Bolivia, and the long-term fieldwork of these authors demonstrated how actually their analysis conflicted with donor claims about what was happening with the water company who were awarded a concession within the municipal area. And while this had been celebrated by international donors as a pro-poor concession, the government ended up terminating the contract early because there were widespread public protests. And this was in a context where the World Bank in the 1990s had been promoting templates for utility privatization, especially for water and sewerage. But they had aimed to moderate this through promoting measurable anti-poverty targets. However, what the research found to explain this public discontent was that in reality, the mandated extensions to the coverage area were not carried out, and claims of increased service coverage were manipulated. And furthermore, the World Bank had a conflict of interest in assessing and promoting this model because the International Finance Corporation, which was its investment arm, had a stake in the operating company. Another area in terms of the enabling environment to consider is that there was often uneven access to education, skills, and professionalism in countries which were recipients of donor money, and this could limit the scope of accountability interventions. So, for example, Smet et al. In Uganda highlight how in rural areas there were often very low literacy rates, which meant there were many types of accountability intervention which were less appropriate. And it was therefore important to involve community members and stakeholders at public gatherings where they could speak to each other directly, because written text and information presented through other mediums often fail to communicate effectively to the intended end users. In terms of governance dynamics, what we found was that international donors and development agencies are most likely to influence water outcomes through their interactions with national governments. So donor funding and resource allocation was often found to influence government priorities and the political will to act. And this was evidenced in a paper focusing on Ethiopia, where international donors had provided regular funding for Wareda block grants. So that's for the local districts in Ethiopia. as well as for social accountability work to allow citizens to monitor local government and hold them to account. And yeah, this has been effective in terms of ensuring leverage with local and national government to ensure that they recognized the value in social accountability models, which empowered citizens and enabled them to take up a more proactive role within the water governance process. Secondly, another finding was around the role of donors and how for them to play a constructive role, there was a need for forums to create regular feedback and exchange of views between donors and implementing partners. And this was important because sustained and committed dialogue could generate more effective political buy-in and constructive alliances between partners and communities. So for example, a paper by Snedden and Fox focusing on the Mekong River Basin demonstrated how, again, historical colonial inequalities had framed the context of donor interventions and prevented the full embrace of policies around accountability, which were perceived to be imported from elsewhere and imposed from above. And while donors had been more inclined to favor participatory approaches to water resource management, river basin governments had resisted these changes, which they believed to be impositions from above. Governments were reluctantly engaged with these participatory exercises to secure donor approval and access funds. And because there wasn't any buy-in from these governments and they didn't believe the claims that this would improve efficiency, equity, or sustainability in water outcomes, it kind of weakens the uptake of these accountability tools and processes. And the conclusion of this paper was that making donor aid conditional on the embrace of participatory measures, as was the case here, could paradoxically discredit such approaches in the eyes of recipient governments if that trust building process hadn't occurred in the run-up to ensure that these efforts were done in good faith and not being imposed. Finally, there was a greater need for external donors to recognize and leverage their power to ensure that governments would protect human rights and maximize space for an autonomous civil society. That was highlighted in the paper I mentioned by Pietus, which focused on accountability work being undertaken against a backdrop of political authoritarianism in Ethiopia at the time, which made accountability monitoring quite challenging. It was also demonstrated in a paper focusing on Tanzania by Water Witness in 2020, and highlighted how a lack of transparency and openness from external donors could also hinder learning and limit accountability within WASH programs. But again, it really highlighted the need for robust relationships between donors, governments, and communities, and kind of strategic navigation of these relationships to basically empower rights holders within communities and ensure that duty bearers were ultimately held to account. Next slide, please. So there were some knowledge gaps within the literature or areas that would benefit from further research, especially in a wider set of geographical regions, so that we could compare the results and see if they were upheld across different geographical settings. The first theme, which recurred again and again, was around trust between different stakeholders, and especially the perceptions of external donors from communities and government. And I think there's a need for greater research to provide evidence on what donors can do to play a constructive role in terms of preventing overreach, interfering with domestic policy making on one hand, but also balancing this with using the leverage that they have to support the most marginalized sectors of society. And again, thinking about these like hierarchies and different scales of governance, and how there was a need for sometimes donors to relinquish some of the power and control that they had in order to ensure that downward accountability was prioritized to communities rather than upwards accountability to people who were dispersing funds. Relatedly, there's a need for more research on how to decolonize aid and development, kind of aligning the accountability work that we're doing with some of these broader conversations which are happening within the development sector more broadly, and thinking about how to empower communities to act with autonomy and to redistribute resources. And in terms of donor approach, there's a need to really think about how donors can create an enabling environment where civil society is empowered to act in a disruptive role, is able to take risks and to stimulate popular participation within water governance, which can empower marginalized groups to act with autonomy and design their own projects and programs. And finally, more evidence is needed around modeling accountability and thinking about how funds can be leveraged at different scales. And this, for example, could use robust budget monitoring or budget tracking within global financial institutions to ensure that there is accountability within all these different layers of governance.